I write this because keeping it inside me would be another kind of seal I cannot bear. I signed the papers the same way everyone did, name, date, a box checked for non-disclosure, and then I walked past the perimeter that smelled of sage and spent diesel and tried to learn a new language of rules. Before I tell you what happened, a short note. If you find this recording useful, if it unsettles you or makes you wonder, stay until the end. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and ring the bell so more people hear this. Share it carefully. There are names in these pages that deserve respect, and there are communities that should not be treated as spectacle. If you comment, please read with that in mind. We were given 6 rules on the first night in the barracks, handed out on a photocopied sheet with an institutional logo and 2 inked fingerprints I assumed belonged to whoever thought security theater meant comfort. I memorized them like a prayer because the site taught you to treat rules as lifelines. Rule 1. Do not stare. A face will look like a face. Hold your gaze no longer than a few heartbeats. If eyes lock for more than 5 seconds, consider yourself marked and act accordingly. Rule 2. Keep seals intact. Salt, ash, tobacco, whatever ceremony or salt ring the keepers lay across doors and vents, those barriers are protocols, not superstition. Rule 3. Never bring reflective glass into the field. Mirrors and camera lenses betray you. Rule 4. Drumming is not music. It is a cadence to be respected and feared. Approach the wellhead with earplugs and a plan, and only if an elder says you may. Rule 5. Conventional force does not finish this. Bullets bruise, and the things simply look back at what used to be. Rule 6. If you are asked to sign a form that says incubation, refuse. If you cannot refuse, burn a copy and bury the rest where the seals say to bury them. Those rules were funny in print and heavy in the night. The first time I walked the fence, the stars were sharp enough to cut, and the tower light swung like the eye of a slow animal. Winter Basin is a long bowl of scrub and low mountains that collect sound. That bowl had been collecting sound for 70 years, since 1951, when the drill struck something under the wellhead and never quite stopped singing. That old date sat in project emergence memos like the starting point of a math problem someone refused to solve honestly. David Antelope taught me how to live with the rules instead of with fear. He was shorter than I expected and older than he let on, his right cheek threaded with a scar that folded his smile into a cautious geometry. He had been at the basin longer than I had been alive in my last city. People deferred to him without meaning to, not because of titles, but because he carried an attention that made you feel noticed in a place designed to unnotice you. "You watch the seals," he told me the first night, while the rest of the staff laughed over stale coffee and whatever the supply truck had brought. "You keep them because the thing knows us by the places we forget to mark. It learns cracks. It walks the seams like a friend." He used ritual words carefully, always attributing specifics to "what my elders have shown me," or "as it is said where I come from," so I never pretended to understand the lineage behind them. That restraint mattered. He also taught me practical things: how to check a tamper strip, how to read night vision for animal movement versus human crouch, how to tell the difference between wind and an old pipe settling. Practicality saved us more than superstition did, until it didn't. Dr. Ruth Sorensen arrived at Winter Basin with a coat that didn't quite fit and a smile that had been practiced on committees. She had the look of someone who believed in schedules and spreadsheet truth. She explained Project Emergence with a slide deck and a voice that would have coaxed market confidence out of a room full of nervous investors. Data acquisition, incubation vectors, subject resilience, long-term viability. When she spoke about the wellhead, she called it anomaly, as if naming took the edge off. "The point," she told me once, palms flat on a metal table, "is not to hurt the place. It's to understand why it happens so we can prevent harm. We have the tools to contain and to study. That is science." She had a way of not meeting your eyes, so you couldn't quite tell if she was searching for moral cover or moral calculus. She believed in control because she believed in harnessing uncertainty. She did not like being resisted. The staff was small enough to feel like a town and large enough for the kinds of losses you could not keep tidy. Garrett Webb showed up with desert tan boots and a laugh that tried to fill his own pockets. He'd been hired as a field tech, 18 months out of some community college and desperate for steady work. He liked to stand too close to the coffee pot and ask people where they were from, like pulling threads to make himself part of a fabric. Tommy and Ray, the 2-day on, 4 days off crew who could fix a generator with a dime and obscene language. Paul managed supplies and the small human economies that break down when you're on a contract that pays late. They were not expendable, we all knew that, and yet the institutional machine treats human cost as a line item if it must. The first anomaly was a cow. It is absurd to remember a cow and then to know that memory is a hinge for everything that followed. One morning in late October, the north pasture was still as glass and full of frost, and a cow had refused to move. It stood by the fence, ribs visible under skin, eyes forward, and on its flank, like a smear of something once human, there was a pale impression that had the wrong angles for a cow. I walked toward it, thinking like a technician. Check vitals, call a vet. Then I saw a face in the cow's flank. Not a cow's face, a face like someone's misremembered self, the template of a neighbor half-remembered. I tell it plainly, there was no gore. There was a transparency of being that was wrong. The smell was not meat so much as stale breath and the metallic tang that clings to memory. Garrett stood beside me and said, "That's not right," like a rote answer. We did what the rules said, kept our distance, radioed back, put up a temporary seal of ash and tobacco until elders could speak to it. The ash smelled like burnt pages. Garrett's watch was the one that failed next. We take watches seriously out there. You're paid to notice when the night is different. He wrote his name on a small sticky pad and stuck it to the inside of his locker, like boys leaving tags in a clubhouse. A shift later, someone found him in the generator bay, knees splayed, staring at a grease-stained mirror someone had left leaning against a shelf. It was an ordinary mirror, a thing like those men carry to check ties, but that morning the mirror held 2 images, the room and the suggestion of something leaning behind him that wasn't actually there. He had been marked. Garrett laughed first. It was the laugh you hear when a person presses at the seams of fear to make it pliable. Then he stopped smiling. His pupils dilated. He began to trace small circles in the air, like a man counting invisible stitches. David found him an hour later, whispering to him soft and low, a cadence of words I never pretended to transcribe. David pressed a hand against Garrett's shoulder, and I watched the lines of a man who'd never been one to lose his temper fold into grief. "If it looks at you and you keep looking," David told us later, after we had sealed Garrett in a spare apartment and wrapped his door with sage and a ring of ash, "it counts you. Counted people keep calling. The count is small to start, then it grows. We put the seal there to slow it. We cannot cut the count. We only buy time." Project Emergence files, which I would later see in a stack of printouts stuffed behind a loose panel in Building A, were full of euphemisms. Subject marking, they called Garrett. Mimetic behavior observed. The documents were stamped with an authorization number and then a redacted line. Some pages had been torn. Others had notes in the margins. Dr. S. If incubation yields replicable consciousness, proceed. Those margin notes were the kind of small handwriting that eats a person. Garrett's change was not immediate. It is a horror the way water erodes rock, slow, patient, impossible to fight with fists. At first he slept badly. He would wake at odd hours and wander to the fence line, press his palms against the cold wire, and stare beyond the perimeter as if trying to read a script that wasn't meant for him. He would call out names that weren't people on site. "Lisa," he'd say. "Tom." Once, in the middle of a machine room humming with the soft sound of servers, he sang like the drumming was under his ribs and the notes were a language he had forgotten but loved. We kept logs,
because logging is what we were trained to do. We listed times, small deviations, the length of eye contact on the initial report. In the files, there is a phrase, the 5-second mark, and it reads like a threshold in some spatial map. If your eye contact crosses it, you become what the basin wants to make you. The response protocol reads like a slow recipe. Cleanse for 72 hours, isolate, soothe, prepare for decline. There were no guarantees. I asked Dr. Sorensen in a hallway where the light was the color of cheap hospital plastic why the memos were redacted. She looked at the monitor on her cart the way people look at a clock when they don't want to answer truthfully. Containment ethics, she said. We have to limit exposure. We don't want panic. The public can't know what we've been able to accomplish. Her hands folded into that posture where a scientist meets statecraft, careful, precise, a blend of legible logic and unreadable motives. Accomplish what? I pressed. Mitigation, she said, and knowledge. There are salvageable properties to study. We can learn a lot about mimicry, about consciousness. We can save future lives. You mean you can use people to save other people? I said. Sacrifice one for the many? She hesitated, and then, with the slow brittleness of someone making a budget decision, she said, No, we make choices, difficult choices. The thing that I had not known before working the basin was how institutional language corrodes empathy into footnotes. Decisions about people get translated into protocols and statistical outcomes, and then the conversations end, and the men who used to joke about baseball scores begin to disappear into the shape of research. Garrett's marking accelerated the night a set of drums started 3 ridgelines away. We were in Building F doing an inventory, an empty hallway that still held the cold echo of fluorescent lights when the sound came. At first it was a throb, like the blood at your temples after a long run. Then it organized, hollow, regular, the skin of something big beating on wood. It walked the air like a measured animal. David looked at me and said, That is the well's memory calling. He did not say myth, he said memory. The drum was not music for him either. It was a recall, a summons, the place remembering what had been inserted into it. Stay inside, Dr. Sorensen ordered before you could call it panic. She spoke into a radio and gave instructions that were both technical and small. Lock doors, check seals, begin the purge protocol. She would later say, in a deposition, that she had done everything the mandates required. At night, the mandates sound like small consolation. The drumming came closer. It reverberated through concrete and the metal ribs of the observation tower. It made the sodium lights hum. Garrett, who had been asleep in a chair with a blanket over his shoulders, woke with a start and smiled like someone who had been reminded of a childhood tune and liked it. He moved to the window, and for the first time since I'd known him, he filled the air with words I could not parse. "It's home," he breathed. "They called me." We tried to be professional. Logs, notifications, lock codes. I don't write that to make myself look brave. I write it because the truth is quieter and its sound is heavier than heroism. We sealed Garrett. We documented the seal. We called the elder who was on call that week. Eleanor Antelope, David's sister, came with a small car and the look of someone who had learned how to be furious and careful at the same time. She wrapped her hands in tobacco as if holding a particle in place and spoke to Garrett in her language with words that the site translator refused to translate into corporate reports. In Eleanor's face, I saw what stewardship looks like. Not a glare, but a kind of iron patience. We consulted the files. The redacted directive, Directive 7, had a header that read, "Emergent Mimetic Pathways," and beneath it, a line of text struck through so heavily it looked like a wound. Someone had written in pencil in the margin, "Experimental Ethical Review pending." The review had not been published. In another document, a date had been scrawled, 1951, the breach. The page folded into itself like someone trying to close a mouth mid-speech. Garrett's eyes went black around the edges like a photograph left too long in the developer. He bled fear in a language we all recognized. He tore down his own seal. He walked past the ash ring like a man walking through a memory. We chased him, we shouted his name, and he turned, and for a full 10 seconds he looked at me, and then at David, and then at the ceiling, like he was reading a page we couldn't see. The 5-second rule failed because the mark is not a clock, it is a slow incision. Garrett stopped at the fence line, put both hands on the wire, and smiled at a horizon where nothing was human. David stood between him and the wellhead like a man trying to hold a levee with his bare hands. "Come back," David said. "Come back, Garrett. Remember your mother's laugh. Remember that thing that made you angry today. Remember what is yours." Garrett tried to laugh. It was wrong. It was full of too many syllables. He reached out toward David, and the thing in him, whatever mimicry had started, threw its face like a curtain. For a second, the face was Garrett and someone else, an attendance of too many voices folded into one mouth. He cried out, and then the sound changed into a drum with human mouth. We did not shoot. We were trained not to, so bullets only blurred and gave the mimic something to wear. Tommy fired rubber rounds, which bounced off and made noises like small hail.
Paul took a thermal camera image that later would look like a smear in a court exhibit. The elders tried a small sealing gesture, ashes and tobacco blown in a circle, the smallest rituals you can perform in a place that used to be a home and is now an experiment. There are things you cannot write about with exactness without stealing meaning from the people who taught you to be careful with words. The elders said something, and Garrett's head tilted. For a moment, he remembered the way his mother's hand would scoop flour into a pan. He blinked. His pupils steadied. Then he collapsed. No blood, no monstrous unmaking, just a fall that felt like a closing. He vomited something that tasted like old metal and regret. The medtechs took him to the infirmary, and we wrapped his door in more ash than the rulebook suggested. He slept for 4 days and then woke a different person, softer, quieter, like someone who had been read a story and could not tell you what it had been about because the language had cracked. We thought it had ended. We were wrong. The documents I found later, those I carried home in a file folder under a jacket like a theft and a penance, made it clear that Garrett's condition was not unique and not stochastic. The project had been cataloging cases since the 50s. They had been counting people like numbers, and the numbers had a shape: mimicry, incubation, replication. The phrase incubation metrics appears in a memo signed by a man whose signature looked like a maze. The memo suggested protocols for using human subjects as vectors. It read like a calculation until you imagine the human face behind the numbers and it becomes a moral ledger. We began to plan because the documents required a response beyond log entries. David and I sat on the top of the observation tower with our knees on cold metal and the basin laid out below like a model someone had left mid-play. He traced the perimeter with a finger, saying the names of places in the map as if conjuring them into clearer definition. "We close the wells," he said. "We seal them. We do what elders do when the earth remembers wrong." "That's not a thing," I answered, because the other world I had lived in used different verbs. "We can't just seal what the state has a license to drill." "It is not a thing until it becomes one," David said. "Eleanor told me stories about this country before there were HR forms, before there were grants. The land remembers what is given and what is taken. We add our marks, and we make the land remember to forget the wrong things." I remember the exact sound of the drill that night, the servers humming in Building A like distant bees, the smell of copper dust in the lab, the sticky tang of the fluorescent lights. I remember Dr. Sorensen clearing her throat and saying, "We need to contain the data before it leaks." She used the word leak as if truth were a pipe and not a wound. She ordered data encryption and a physical purge. We began to plan, because the documents required a response beyond log entries. David and I sat on the top of the observation tower with our knees on cold metal and the basin laid out below like a model someone had left mid-play. He traced the perimeter with a finger, saying the names of places in the map as if conjuring them into clearer definition. "We close the wells," he said. "We seal them. We do what elders do when the earth remembers wrong." "That's not a thing," I answered, because the other world I had lived in used different verbs. "We can't just seal what the state has a license to drill." "It is not a thing until it becomes one," David said. "Eleanor told me stories about this country before there were HR forms, before there were grants. The land remembers what is given and what is taken. We add our marks, and we make the land remember to forget the wrong things." I remember the exact sound of the drill that night, the servers humming in Building A like distant bees, the smell of copper dust in the lab, the sticky tang of the fluorescent lights. I remember Dr. Sorensen clearing her throat and saying, "We need to contain the data before it leaks." She used the word leak as if truth were a pipe and not a wound. She ordered data encryption at a physical purge.
Someone with a keycard would come with the authority to remove physical drives. Her hands were steady. Her voice was a scalpel. We did not talk about burning Building A in the open, not in those words. We used softer strategies: disrupt the chain, data obfuscation, denial just long enough to move things. People with families and rent checks and student loans learned to dress sabotage in verbs that sounded like consulting tasks. David taught me a different vocabulary: purification and closing, but with the same consequence. It was Garrett who made the choice easier and more terrible. He would not sit and be researched, not after he had seen what his reflection could do when given time to learn. He met us in the dim of the kitchen with coffee that tasted like despair, and handed me a packet of photos he had taken on a camera no one had cleared. "This was at night," he said. "There were pictures of a figure in the pasture, of a shadow with the wrong number of elbows, of a man leaning over a gate with a face where a horse's jaw should be. In one photo you could see a small smear on the lip of the wellhead like old wax. They think they can keep it neat," Garrett said, "but they don't understand memory. You can't extract it without taking pieces." He wanted to act. He wanted to make what Project Emergence had done stop. I wanted to act because passivity felt like complicity, and I wanted to act because I could not sleep knowing that someone might be cataloged as an experiment and never reclaimed. David wanted to act because his land had been processed into case studies and he wanted to give it back. We wrote plans in the margins of directives. We punched holes in paper with the tips of our pens to make maps. We rehearsed routes in the quiet like thieves rehearsing sentences. But the thing that made us dangerous was not the plan's technicality. It was the moral clarity that had replaced our fear. We wanted to make a wound in the institution so the land could be stitched on its own terms. The night we put it into motion, the drumming started early. It came not from beyond the ridge but from under our feet, the sound of a thing that wasn't satisfied with its container. The tower light blinked. The servers in Building A whined like 1,000 waking insects. Someone left a single camera pointed at the wellhead, and the recorded image later showed what looked like a reflection catching and holding light like a mouth. We moved in two directions: the ritual and the data. David and a handful of elders and keepers, men and women with hands that had learned the contour of the land, walked down to the wellhead to perform what they could without giving away the practice. I went with the others towards Building A to fulfill a plan that had the single blunt purpose of erasing the project's capacity to weaponize memory. I will not write the how in step by step. I will tell you about smell and stakes. There was the smell of oil and old paper in the server room. There was the flash of heat when something gave. There was the small, stupid way that people's faces become thin masks under emergency lights. There was the rattle of a lock and a burned thumb from a wire you grabbed because the plan required that you be willing to get singed. And there was Dr. Sorensen, who chose a door to block and a file to protect. When I cornered her in an access corridor, she looked at me,
and for the first time there was fatigue in her calculation. "You don't know what you're doing," she said. "You think you can control the narrative. You think destroying drives undoes harm." "It stops you from continuing," I said. "It makes you choose the hard way. Let the courts take you. Let the elders take the land back. You can say you were trying to help, but somebody will ask what you paid to learn, and someone will hold you accountable." She laughed once, close to despair. "Accountability," she repeated, "as if the world runs on a ledger that you are allowed to balance. We are trying to keep the rest of the country safe. We are making trade-offs." I did not have a better word. I had only the heat of the corridor and the smell of wiring. I heard the drums through the wall, and then a sound that was not a drum, a long, animal exhale. Somewhere else, David called out a name. When Building A caught and the smoke curled like an animal that had been startled, the sirens came later than I thought they would. People ran and saved what they could. Some drove out with boxes of personal effects. Others stood and watched property that had always felt larger than people turn into black emulsions. Garrett sat on a cooler with a blanket around his shoulders and did not cry so much as make a small noise repeatedly, a loss refined into sound. We thought the fire would make the incident simple for external audiences, an electrical fault, a lab accident. But the ledger of truth doesn't fold up neatly. Documents surfaced. Papers the size of leaves found their way out of the ruins. A few brave reporters asked the right questions. Eleanor filed a motion. The tribe raised its voice. The state asked for inquiries. Lawsuits started like a terrible new crop. The breach's physical symptoms slowed, and then, in a night that smelled like ash and burned plastic and something like rain, I stood by the wellhead and listened. The drumming was a dying animal now, or perhaps a wound being cauterized. David's hands were crimson, whether from his own blood or the red ochre he sometimes used, I could not tell. And he whispered words that were both prayer and instruction. They were not procedural. They were the language of people who had never gotten permits for what they cherished. Garrett did not recover in any ordinary sense. He left the basin when his papers allowed it, and he would not speak much about what he saw. Tommy, Ray, Paul, some returned to their towns, others found other contracts. Dr. Sorensen maintained an expression of sorrow threaded with righteous fury, and later gave testimony that insisted she had been trying to save lives, even as the margins of memos suggested otherwise. The company that ran Project Emergence paid a settlement and then quietly shifted assets to an offshore unit with a name that evaporated when you said it aloud. The legal aftermath felt less like justice and more like an accounting. The land changed hands. Eleanor and David, with counsel and patience and a moral ferocity that the institutions underestimated, managed to have the titles altered until the wellhead sat on land administered by the tribal nation. There were hearings and compensations and a concerted effort by the tribe to reclaim not just paperwork but the work of watching. In the weeks after, I drove out at dawn and stood at the perimeter fence with a thermos of coffee gone cold. The place was quieter, but quiet in a way that is complicated, a watchfulness rather than an absence. The seals were inspected daily, the ash circles were renewed. People with the right names came occasionally, not to study but to consult. And the keepers, David, Eleanor, taught them not how to pry but how to listen. There is a price. David descended into a cavern the night of the final sealing, Eleanor told me later, and I will not try to repeat the precise liturgy she used, and he came back with a wound that would not heal easily. He said it was worth it. He said the land slept differently now, but sleep did not mean forgetting. There would be a watch, as long as memory required it. I still keep one of Garrett's photographs in my wallet. It is faded at the edges, like everything that matters does in time. It shows a patch of pasture with a ring of ash in the distance and a shadow where a man might stand. There is a reflection caught in a puddle like a second image of the same world. Sometimes, when I look at it, I feel the old cadence under my ribs, the echo of drums when the night opens, and I remember the rules that sound like a litany. Do not stare, keep the seals, burn what must not live in filings and in the minds of men who think curiosity excuses cruelty. We learned that institutions can forget what the land remembers, and that forgetting can become violent. We learned that traditional knowledge, when treated with contempt, becomes a target rather than a partner. And we learned that repair is messy. It involves courtrooms and fire reports and the careful, patient work of people who will not let a place be reduced to case studies. At the perimeter now, there is a small sign that bears no corporate logo, just a name and a request: tend the memory. People stop and read it like a benediction. They leave small handfuls of tobacco or a smooth stone. They look out at the wellhead. They say nothing for a beat, and then move away with the solemnity of people who have been given an inheritance they are not yet sure how to guard.
What you must know, if you think of going where we went, is this. The rules are not curses or superstitions manufactured to scare novices. They are practices crafted to buy time and respect memory. They are instructions written by people who have watched and been wounded and chosen to make a different vow. They are, at base, the difference between a place being used and a place being stewarded. If you listen to the wrong person, if you allow research to become extraction, you will find that the land answers back in ways that are not simple. If you work with people who know those answers, people like David and Eleanor, then there is a chance for repair. That chance is not tidy. It is paid for. It is blood and oath and stubborn ceremony that refuses to become data points. I keep writing because I cannot let the ledger be only numbers. I want to name who saved what could be saved and who paid the penance. I want to say that Garrett's face returned to him in small increments, and that when he laughed, he sounded different, softer, as if he were trying to laugh for two people at once. I want to say that Dr. Sorensen left the basin and wrote articles about ethical constraints in emergent research, and that the world heard her and then moved on, because discomfort is often temporary in institutions built to ignore the inconvenient parts of their success. When the drums finally fell silent that winter, I walked the fence line with David and Eleanor. They taught me where to reinforce a bank of ash and where not to lay a mirror. They taught me to make a ring and to respect its breaking points. They did not show me sacred words. They showed me how to be careful with the land's memory and with people's stories. That was the work, not to speak for the land, but to stand with it. Sometimes, at night, when the basin is a bowl of sleep and the stars are the same as they've always been, I still hear something like a distant drum. It is less insistent than before, like a metronome that has been set to hold time rather than to call people into being. I stand and put my hand to the fence and remember the rules and the faces. If there is a single lesson I can force into plain language for anyone who finds these words and thinks that this is a story to test and then forget, it is this: respect restraints that come from knowledge rooted in place. Distrust the language of progress that removes people into variables, and above all, remember that some things wear faces like gloves. Do not let them learn your shape. I am still here. I write because telling helps keep the watch. The land has been given back to the people who belong to it now, but stewardship is not a final checkbox. It is ongoing, a slow labor. There are nights I dream of drums and offices and the smell of copper. There are days I drive out and help inspect a seal or hand a small stone to a child who wants to understand without being told everything. I do not offer triumph. I offer a sober, uneasy hope, cut through with sorrow and responsibility. People were hurt. People made choices. People stayed. That is what I know. Tonight, if you listen in the silence between the radio static, you might catch something like a heartbeat. It might be the earth. It might be memory.
It might be the remnant of a thing that learned too well how to look. I will finish this later, with documents and a list of names, and the things that happened after the courts began their slow eating of truth. For now, I leave you with the knowledge we were given on our first night, and the face of the man who taught me to treat memory like a fragile animal, the 6 rules, which are not dramatic but practical. The rest of the story, the descent, the ceiling, the cost, has weight enough to deserve its own telling. The 6 rules were plain when David first wrote them down on the inside flap of an old field notebook, the ink smudged from rain or sweat, sometimes both. He folded the page over so it would not fall out, and handed the book to me without a speech. "Keep them," he said. "Learn them by the fence. They are stupid and obvious until you need them. I will list them here as he taught them, not as aphorisms, but as instruments, with the small explanations that came after each one when we had mud on our boots and the sky was a bruise. 1. Do not map the face. You may chart topography, note soil types, measure pH, take photographs of flora and livestock. You must not make detailed records that attempt to locate or reproduce a face. No composite sketches, no layered imaging, no attempts to reconstruct a countenance from memory or sample. Memory is not data. It resists being reduced. If you attempt to convert a living resemblance into a precise object, you invite duplication. Names belong to people. Faces belong to memory. 2. Never place a mirror where it can catch the basin. Not for vanity, not for science. Mirrors sharpen attention into an edge. They show angles of things that were meant to remain oblique. They sharpen what should be blurred, and teach whatever watches there how to see itself. That is how learning becomes mimicry. 3. When you are given an object, return a small part of yourself. If you take a stone or a scrap of cloth for preservation, you leave, physically, ritually, a hair, a splinter from a tool, a patch sewn into a pocket. The trade is not symmetric. It insists that you do not extract without offering an anchor. This was never about reciprocity as a moral ledger. It was about tethering, object to human, memory to keeper. 4. Never let the land be emptied of its people. Gatherings matter. Even if the people you gather are only the ones who come to see the light leave, their presence is a buffer. Communities slow the extraction instinct. Where there are living witnesses, the land is less likely to be flattened into a diagram and carried away in crates. 5. Speak only in the voice of the question. When you need to know something, ask. Do not command. Do not insist. Do not attempt to sound certain in your phrasing. Certainty is an invitation. The basin responds to force. 6. Remember who named you there. Before you plant, before you mark a boundary, take a name, your own, spoken aloud, and give it to the bank or the wellhead. Do this in the presence of 2 witnesses. Names are slow anchors. They do not prevent everything, but they make repair possible. That is the list, as dry as it looks. Each rule had a story attached to it, and the stories were the parts that taught us how brittle the rules become when ignored. The first incident happened the summer before the trial, when a small team from a university lab arrived with equipment that could make the earth hum. They were young and hungry. The lead technician had a neat salt and pepper beard and a grant in his briefcase. He said the basin needed a baseline and a reproducible data set. David asked him what he wanted to baseline. The man laughed like someone who had rehearsed this answer. Everything, he said. If we can quantify the anomaly, we can study it safely, we can control it. Eleanor watched him from the shade of the fence. She had cleaned Garrett's cut with lotion and whispered a story into his ear while he slept. She stood now with a water bottle and a face that had learned to measure caution. "We will not let you empty this place," she said, and they argued long enough that the technician's assistants began to get impatient. On the second day, one of the assistants brought a small hand mirror to prop on a tripod to see how light played off the new surveyor's equipment. He didn't mean harm. He wanted neat reflections to calibrate a camera. The mirror caught an angle of the ground, and something looked back from that angle that did not have a name. It did not look like an animal or a patch of sky. It looked like the idea of a face, a suggestion of eyes. The assistant laughed and took a photograph as if nothing had happened. Within hours, Garrett, who had been walking the perimeter because his legs had begun to need the slow motion of the earth beneath him, came across a line of small beetles, arranged as if in a seam. Their shells glittered. He felt a pressure behind his teeth, like a child clamping down on a loose tooth. He walked to the wellhead and stood there, touching the wood. For a long minute he did not move. Then he took his hand away, and there was a skin mark on his palm, not a bruise, but a faint impression of a pattern he had not seen before. When he laughed later, the sound split. The mirror had given the basin something to learn with, and Garrett had been its first lesson. They dragged the assistant's mirror behind the fence the next day and buried it beneath a cairn of small stones. The assistant left the project 2 weeks later with a nervous tick in his hand and a contract terminated for unprofessional conduct.
The university rewrote a paragraph in its publicity. It is easy to tell that story as scandal and moral failing, easy to narrate the cause and effect as if the moral universe neatly reparates. It is less tidy to describe what we did to fix the damage. We did not have a protocol in the clinical sense. We made a ceremony out of returning. Eleanor braided hair from 3 of the oldest women who still came to the basin and wove the braids into a small rough rope. We took that rope and walked the fence with it, binding at points of old hurt. We washed the mirror stone with earth and then with salt, not to destroy it but to teach it separation. Garrett, who had learned to laugh for 2 people, sat with the mirror stone and held it while he recited the name of the place and then his own name. It cost him something. He later said it had cost him a memory of a day he'd wanted to keep. The mirror's surface dulled. That is not a triumph. That is a bruise that chose to stop hurting. The descent, the thing you asked me to tell, was not a single event but a sequence of decisions piled on one another until there was no choice left. The basin is not a hole in the ground. It is a bowl folded out of memory and water and a compression of people's acts. When the pulse grew sharper, when the drums were not a rumor but a cadence beneath the loam, the council that had gathered around the fence, farmers, a retired teacher, a pair of kids who mended fences, the local coroner, and us, made the plan we could live with. We used what we had always used: ash from the wood David burned in winter, stones taken from the river not far from where children skip pebbles, lengths of linen stitched together from clothes that had been worn on the land. We dug with hands and spades. We chanted no words that would translate into anything modern. We sang in a minor, off-key, so our voices would be human and not commanding. We walked a circle 3 times and set the stones like teeth. We stacked them with interstitial pockets where a handful of hair or a scrap of cloth might be placed. We spoke names, the name of the place, the names of those who had been present in its protection, the names of the people who had been lost to its learning. Names make doing shrubby and slow, not clinical. Garrett went with us into the hollow because he was the one who understood how to be careful, and because he had already paid a sort of debt. His laugh had been altered in the mirror. He wore a scarf Eleanor had woven and held the stone she had given him. At a certain shallow depth, the hair on his arms prickled. The air tasted faintly of old copper and river silt. The drum was not a drum anymore. It had become an accounting. At the lowest point, we built an arrangement, a seal, if you must call it that, though the word brings machinery to an old and merciful rite. The seal was not an attempt to delete what was there. It was an attempt to teach the basin to remember at a pace that would not swallow people. We laid a ring of ash. We placed mirrors, wrapped in cloth, at a distance from the ring. Then we spoke the names and left them there as offerings, but kept our hands off the mirrors themselves. We filled a small iron box with a few shards, a notch of a broken lens, the label from a discarded sample tube, the corner of a note card with a name that had been carelessly crossed out. The box was not a vault. It was a ledger, a place where one could see the cost. Garrett made the decision that none of us wanted him to make, but that he volunteered for without fanfare. He descended into the ring and planted the iron box on the damp earth. Then he lay upon it for a long time, with his breath synchronized to the metronome we had invented. He took from us a small scrap of his jacket and sewed it into the lining of the box. He placed his name upon a slip and tucked it under a stone so that it would be anchored. It was a small thing, quietly heroic. The land received the offering, and, if the land can be said to have acted deliberately, it accepted it at a cost. Garrett returned. He returned slower and more careful. He returned with a hairline scar like a small, pale crescent at the base of his skull. He joked later that he had traded a day of laughter to keep a lot of other days. People suffered consequences that law could and could not account for. The court hearings lasted months. Dr. Sorensen testified in a way that burned both her reputation and her conscience. She spoke about institutional failures, about the ways the language of innovation had been used to paper over ethical rot. The attorneys called terms, emergent property, unanticipated learning, as if naming spared them grief. The press wanted outrages and scandals. The university released statements, then counterstatements. A benefactor retracted a pledge. A journal published a correction and then placed an editorial note. All of these moved like water on the surface. Below, the work of stitching and of sitting with the basin continued. Some people left the area. Some were offered settlements. Some jobs evaporated and were replaced by quieter forms of labor. Garrett took to visiting schools and speaking about care, but he never told students the technical parts. He told them instead to look at their hands and think of the names they carry there. That was his pedagogy. He stopped being the sort of person who pursued recognition. He became a man who showed up and carried wood. Eleanor and David, who had both been reluctant to speak in public, found themselves summoned to hearings and committees. They gave simple testimonies about what it meant to live with a place that remembers. They were accused of superstition. They were praised as stewards. Neither description satisfied them. They wanted the law to understand that stewardship is a daily, often boring responsibility. An inspection of a seal, a mending of a fence, a careful conversation with a neighbor who wanted to sell the land because debt had been too heavy. They wanted to teach others how to make those little repairs. The law could make some things official, restrictions on excavation, mandates for oversight, but it could not write the tacit knowledge into the bones of a community. That work had to be done by people willing to be slow. The basin did not remain silent in all of this. Sometimes the wind would pick up along the fence and carry a sound like a faint drum again. Sometimes a child would find a pebble that fitted oddly into the shape of his palm. Once a calf was born with a gray patch that everyone swore looked like a thumbprint, and the farmer named it for the day of its being and kept it at the edge of his herd as if to show visitors that there are things you do not take casually. I kept writing. I gathered names as best I could. I obtained invoices and filed them in a box, the sort of thing auditors might care for, and I taped photos into the notebook's margins. A stone circled by ash, a child's palm with a faint print, Garrett's scar at the base of his skull, Eleanor's hands working a rope. I got drawings of the seal made by a sympathetic illustrator in town. Simple, not exact. They are in the folder I will put with the other documents. The courts ate truth in the way courts must when they are tasked with matters that straddle law and myth. Slowly, with an appetite. They ordered further studies. They granted injunctions. They fined. They admonished. They did not, I must say plainly, make things whole. There was a cost in intimacy, too. Old friendships frayed.
People who had been neighbors for decades found themselves taking opposing sides in depositions. Accusations of selfishness and of attention-seeking were hurled in ways that hurt more than the legal damages. A woman who had, for years, been a regular at the basin refused afterward to speak to anyone who had supported more aggressive research. That silence took on a grief of its own. What surprised me most, or perhaps what finally taught me the size of the debt, was how the basin changed the way we told our stories. We had to learn to say less, to teach children not the lurid parts, but how to carry a name. We had to choose who would be allowed to take a story home and in what form. We learned to accept that some truths would remain partial, and that some questions we asked aloud should have been whispered. There was an instance during the sealing where a well-meaning journalist came out with a recorder and a bottle of hand sanitizer and asked questions as if the basin were a museum exhibit. David, who had once been more patient with outsiders, closed his mouth like a fist. He said later that the man's questions were all about spectacle and none about assent. We escorted the man out.
The article he wrote elsewhere was long and titled with a flourish. It gave the public what it wanted and still left the basin to do its slow work. Perhaps the hardest part, apart from watching people you love become quieter and more careful about how they sleep, was reconciling that our actions, however careful, had not forestalled pain. Some had been harmed, some went beyond repair. The basin took its toll like any long, difficult marriage. Small betrayals, misaligned expectations, injuries that never quite knit together. We kept the ledger not to obsess, but to remember. Names to read aloud on a cold afternoon, to say their weight into the wind. And then there were the nights when the metronome slowed. The sound was still there, but it would sometimes shift into something almost like a relief. The fences settled. The mirrors we had interred went dull. The legal papers stacked. Some got shredded in careless offices, some were archived. Dr. Sorensen published a piece in which she recanted certain scientific claims and advocated for stricter frameworks. People read it, some nodded, most returned to their work. The basin remained constitutional in ways that do not translate into statutes, a place that had been given back slowly with many small and imperfect stitches. I will not pretend that there is closure. There are days I drive out and stand by the fence and watch the children play and think the basin is safer. There are other nights when I wake to the image of a face like a glove turning in the dark. I keep the notebook on my bedside table for that reason, to remind me that vigilance is not paranoia. It is a kind of respect. If you read these words and think the rules are quaint or that ceremonies are theatrical, then you have not yet been given a face to learn from. If you think of moving through a place as if you own its measurements, as if you can translate grief into an algorithm and call it knowledge, then please, hear this plainly. The basin taught us that knowledge without reverence becomes appropriation, and appropriation eats the future. Do not map the face. Do not place mirrors where they can learn the basin's angles. Bring a sliver of your own life when you take. Keep gatherings, ask questions, name yourself there. I have been asked to give a list of names and documents in a formal setting. I will do that. The boxes are near my desk. Their contents read like a chronicle of small, stubborn care. Receipts, faded news clippings, the iron box Garrett placed into the ring with its scraps sewn into the lining, Eleanor's rope, the photographs that are consistent but not exhaustive. They will be useful to historians or lawyers. They will be useful, I hope, to anyone who needs to know that the work of repair is neither quick nor glamorous. Tonight, the stars are ordinary. The fence creaks in a way that sounds plausibly like ocean when the wind is right. From the porch, I hear a dog bark in the distance, and the low, half-remembered laugh Garrett sometimes lets out when he is with children. The basin has not been vanquished, nor has it become a museum piece kept behind glass and academic monographs. It is a place under care. There is more to tell. The particulars of the court transcripts, the small acts of penance some of the researchers performed quietly, the way a neighbor's child learned to murmur names like charms, and the time a visiting team tried to move a portion of the seal and found their instruments refusing to work. Those entries belong with the documents, and they deserve the patient attention of a separate telling. For now, these are the things I can put down without pretending they are complete. The 6 rules, the descent and the ring, Garrett's offering and scar, the court hearings that ate and rearranged reputations, the slow ongoing labor of stewardship. I do not end with triumph. I end with the knowledge that the watch continues and that telling is a part of the watch. I will return to the ledger. There are names still to write, and there are testimonies I promised I would transcribe. If you are coming to the basin because you have read something of this and are tempted by the border between curiosity and possession, remember those 6 rules and the weight they carry. Take nothing that is not offered. Offer something in return. Sit with the land and allow it to teach you the rhythm of patience. When the drums are very far away, they are almost like a heartbeat. Sometimes I rest my hand on the fence and I think I can feel it, an echo of breathing. Sometimes I press my ear to the hollow and imagine that the basin is whispering its ledger back at me in pieces, slow and patient, like someone who has learned how to bear memory without being consumed by it. There will be other entries. There will be, among the documents, testimonies that will not be flattering, stories of anger and of those who refuse to listen. There will be lists of names and small items cataloged with a love that is almost legalistic. It is my task to bring them forward when the time is right. For now, I close the notebook and let the page fall where it will. I will walk the fence one more time before I sleep. The work remains.